This video is brought to you by Brilliant. As you might already know, the US has a bit of a debt problem. America has a pretty massive debt pile, and recent administrations have picked up a dangerous habit of running pretty massive deficits. America's debt to GDP ratio currently stands at about 123%, one of the highest in the world, and most economists expect Trump's policies to add to the $2 trillion deficit he inherited from Biden. For context, the deficit Biden ran last year represented an eye-watering 6.4% of GDP, the largest in the OECD apart from Israel, and more than 3 times the 2% average for other advanced economies. Now, obviously, this isn't new news. People have been talking about America's unsustainable debt situation for years, and only a couple of months ago, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he aspired to halve the deficit to 3% of GDP by the end of Trump's term. Nonetheless, the looming risk of recession and the recent rise in Treasury yields have put even more strain on America's fiscal position, and sparked renewed speculation about Trump resorting to some sort of unorthodox workaround if America's debt burden becomes unbearable. So, in this video, we're going to look at why America's debt crisis is suddenly getting worse, and why there probably isn't an unorthodox fix available. If you're a TLDR fan and want to support the channel, then consider picking up a copy of our magazine. Too Long helps to fund all of our journalism, and allows us to make free videos for YouTube like this one. You can learn more and buy a copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, America's fiscal situation has suddenly started looking even more precarious for at least 5 reasons. First, the recent rise in US bond yields. During times of economic turmoil, the cost of borrowing for the US usually falls as investors move out of riskier assets like stocks and into US government bonds as a safe asset. During the most recent bout of Trump-induced turmoil, however, this didn't happen, and Treasury yields actually rose as investors drew their money out of the US entirely. While Treasury yields have come down somewhat since, they're still pretty high by historical standards, which makes it more expensive for the US to issue new debt and pay off the interest on, or service, the $36 trillion of outstanding debt. Debt servicing is already costing the US about $1 trillion a year, roughly the same as the defense budget, and the risk here is that the US gets caught in some sort of debt doom loop, where servicing costs force more borrowing, which means higher servicing costs, etc. The second reason things look worse is the recent economic slowdown. Trump's unpredictable tariffs have scuppered both consumer and business confidence, putting a drag on growth and increasing the risk of recession. In its latest forecast, the IMF downgraded its growth forecast for the US from 2.7% to 1.8%, and estimated there was now a 40% probability of a recession this year. Weak growth, let alone a recession, would put even more strain on America's finances, because it means more unemployment, and thus higher welfare spending and fewer tax receipts. The third reason is Doge. We've covered this in previous videos, but the TLDR is that so far, Doge has failed to make a meaningful dent in public spending, and now looks essentially defunct given Musk's withdrawal. You can sort of see this if you just look at the federal government's outlays, which are published daily by the Treasury. So far this year, the government has actually spent more than in any previous year apart from 2021, when spending was elevated thanks to the pandemic. The fourth reason is inflation. Again, thanks to Trump's tariffs, most economists now expect inflation to increase markedly over the next few months. Citibank, for instance, now forecasts headline inflation to peak at about 4% this year, up from about 2% before the tariffs. Inflation can actually be good for an indebted government, because if the government borrows its own currency, like the US does, then inflation reduces the real value of the debt. However, the Federal Reserve has signalled that higher inflation will invite higher interest rates, which will both increase servicing costs for the government and slow the economy down even further. The fifth and final reason is the budget reconciliation bill that Republicans are currently pushing through Congress. This currently includes an extension of the tax cuts Trump introduced in 2017, which are estimated to add $5 trillion or so to the deficit over the next 10 years, and could yet include some of the more gimmicky tax cuts mentioned during the campaign, like no tax on tips. Congressional Republicans claim they'll offset about $1 trillion of this with spending cuts, made mostly by the Energy and Commerce Committee. This might sound innocuous, but this committee, for some unknown reason, has jurisdiction over both Medicare and Medicaid, which is where these cuts would almost definitely have to come from. This is hard to square with Trump's very explicit commitment to protect both programs, and if he vetoes these cuts, which he said he would, this would both push the deficit wider and imply that Trump lacks the political capital to make meaningful spending cuts in the future. So, you get the idea. America's fiscal position was already looking pretty precarious before Trump, but now looks likely to get even worse. And this ever-growing debt burden, combined with the fact that Trump has shown zero willingness to make politically painful spending cuts, has led to some speculation that Trump might ultimately have to resort to some unorthodox fix if the debt burden becomes unbearable. As we see it, there are at least 3 funky ideas floating about at the moment. The first is something we covered a week ago, sacking Fed Chair Jerome Powell and forcing his successor to cut interest rates and bring down borrowing costs. This probably wouldn't work, because firing Powell would probably lead to a disastrous market crash, which is presumably why Trump quickly walked it back, but he might try it as a last resort. The second is somehow forcing nominal allies, or at least those who are dependent on the US security umbrella, to buy more US government debt. This idea often comes up in the context of the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord, which again we covered in a previous video, and it was something Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent explicitly floated last year when he suggested the US could force NATO states that weren't spending enough on defense to buy 50-year military bonds from the US. The third is unilaterally extending the maturities on America's outstanding debt. In other words, taking debt that the US issued back when interest rates were low, refusing to pay out when these bonds are actually due, and instead just continuing to pay that lower interest rate. This is cheaper than letting those lower interest rate bonds mature and issuing higher interest rate ones now. And at least some legal experts think the US could do this without a technical default. To be honest though, any unorthodox fix would probably undermine confidence in US debt entirely and trigger a financial crisis. So Trump, and America more generally, would probably be better off just raising taxes or cutting spending, like the rest of the world. At TLDR News, we're always trying to help you learn more about the world around you. Luckily for us, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, shares this same commitment. Their thousands of interactive lessons in maths, science, programming, data analysis, and AI are designed to help you learn by actually doing, rather than asking you to mindlessly memorize stuff. For instance, each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. This helps you build your critical thinking skills and ultimately become a better thinker. Brilliant's newly updated maths courses help you establish a strong foundation in algebra, then helps you build on this, teaching you how to conquer calculus, all while maintaining an emphasis on problem solving and reasoning. The thing I like best about this though is that their mathematical courses help you develop your mathematical intuition and fluency, skills that you can use in the real world. As we've told you before, data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.